Hello friend, welcome back to my kitchen. My name is Becky if you're new, and today we are gonna make 6 different artisan bread recipes. I'm gonna make one recipe at a time, so if you're only interested in learning how to make one recipe, the written printable recipe will be linked down below and timestamped so you can skip directly to that recipe. The recipes we are gonna be making today are 2 artisan style kind of crusty loaves. One is an overnight no knead, and one is you can start and bake it in one day. A beautiful white sandwich bread, buttery, delicious dinner rolls, a fantastic focaccia, and a beautiful ciabatta. If you are new to bread baking and feel intimidated by any of these recipes, please don't be. Sit back, relax, and enjoy, and you can just see how simple and easy it is to make these recipes with no real specific equipment. You can do it all by hand if you don't have a mixer, and no crazy ingredients or anything like that. So sit back, relax, and enjoy how to make 6 artisan style bread recipes. After we make the focaccia and the ciabatta bread, I'm gonna show you how we're gonna turn both of those loaves of bread into an incredibly delicious sandwich. And I'm gonna start by making the focaccia first. I have 2 cups of just room temperature water. And to that, I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of active dry yeast. Some of these recipes are gonna call for active dry yeast, and some are gonna call for instant yeast. Active dry yeast needs to be bloomed first in the water for a few minutes before you start working with it. Instant, you can just put your yeast in here along with all your other ingredients and move on with the recipe. But because this is active dry, I'm gonna let this sit for about 5 minutes while the yeast comes alive. This has been sitting for about 5 minutes. I've been watching bubbles come up to the top, and now we can add the rest of our ingredients. Now I'm gonna be using bread flour in this recipe, and I like to fluff my flour before I use it if I'm not gonna weigh it out. Some of these recipes are gonna call for bread flour, some of them are gonna call for all-purpose flour. You generally can interchange the two. Just know that bread flour has a lot more protein in it than all-purpose flour, and it's gonna give you a more chewier, breadier texture. And so if you only have all-purpose flour, don't let that stop you from making some of these recipes that call for bread flour. Just know you might get a little bit of a lighter bread and you're not gonna get quite as much of that chew, and that's okay. 3, and this is 4. Sometimes I weigh my flour and sometimes I use cups and measures. Next, we're gonna add our salt and olive oil. And with focaccia, you wanna make sure you're using a high quality olive oil because this flavor is gonna come through in the final bread, and you wanna make sure you like that flavor. So I like to make sure I use an olive oil I like the taste of before using it in this bread recipe. Now we're gonna mix this together, and this is gonna be a very sticky, shaggy dough. It's gonna be almost impossible to get in there with your hands without it just sticking to everything, but that's okay. This is all we have to do to mix this together. I'm gonna cover this, and I'm gonna take this and just set it over here, and in 30 minutes, we are gonna do what's called a stretch and fold. There's no kneading that has to be done for this other than gentle stretches and folds. So in 30 minutes, I'll show you what that looks like. The focaccia is ready for its first set of stretch and folds. The first time I ever heard the concept of stretch and folds, I was super confused and it felt really intimidating. Let me show you how easy a stretch and fold is. The goal with a stretch and fold is to create gluten very gently through the stretching and folding process. Gluten can be formed inside dough a few different ways, and gluten is formed in dough, it's not in wheat itself. So in wheat, there are 2 proteins that in the presence of water, those 2 proteins form together and form gluten. And you can form gluten 2 ways, by either one, kneading the dough a lot, or letting a very hydrated dough like this sit for a long time in the presence of water, and that will gently create gluten. So for the focaccia, we are going to allow this hydrated dough to form gluten just by sitting, but also we are going to gently form gluten with the stretch and folds and create a little bit of a stronger dough. All we have to do is wet our hands because our wet hands stick less to the dough. And I'm gonna go from one side of the dough, stretch and pull over. It's still a very shaggy, loose dough, but as we do this, the dough will become a little bit stiffer and a little bit stronger. The next recipe we're gonna make is gonna be a no knead recipe and no stretching and folding, and that is gonna form gluten just by time. You can see already that it's a little bit stronger of a dough as we do this. I usually do it about 5 or 6 times, or until the dough doesn't really wanna pull anymore and fold on top of itself. Maybe we'll do one more time. I'm gonna cover this and we're gonna let this sit for another half an hour. In 30 minutes from now, we're gonna do that exact same thing and we're gonna repeat that process 2 more times. And you're gonna see how the dough starts to form up into a nice dough, not just kind of a shaggy mess. This is the second stretch and fold, and after each one, you're really gonna see the difference, and you don't do anything different. You do the same thing, just wet your hands, pull, stretch it over, and repeat that process. And you'll see how the dough really starts to come together. We're not only trying to gently form gluten, but we're trying to organize the gluten structures as well to create a good backbone for the big bubbles that we want in this focaccia. Now, one thing that I first thought when I started making bread was that it was super intimidating, and you hear people say baking is a science and you have to follow the directions exactly and you need to weigh out all your ingredients, and if you miss a step, it's going to fail. Well, one thing I've learned over the last few years of really diving into bread baking is that it's a lot more to do with the feel and look as opposed to just following the recipe exactly. And bread is very forgiving. I have made this same recipe where I don't do stretch and folds. I mix it up together. I throw it in the fridge because I don't have time, and it still makes a beautiful focaccia. And so just know that if you're just starting to get into bread baking and you miss a step or you don't weigh out your ingredients, you can still have a delicious homemade bread product that is going to taste better than anything you can buy in the store. And you're only going to get more comfortable baking bread the more you do it. So here you can see after our final stretch and fold just how beautiful a ball of dough we have here. So I'm going to cover this and then we are going to... Now this is gonna go into the refrigerator overnight, and I will see you back tomorrow when we actually turn this dough into focaccia bread. It is the next day, and we're going to prep the dough for the second rise, or proof. Here we have a 9x13 baking dish. I'm gonna put a few tablespoons of olive oil in the bottom of this pan, and again, this is the most important oil that tastes delicious because that flavor is really gonna come through in the final flavor. Here is our dough that is absolutely stunning, that's been sitting in the fridge overnight. And I'm gonna do here what are called coil folds, and I'm just gonna gently lift the dough off the pan and have it fold up underneath itself. This doesn't have to be done perfect either. When I first started making this, would just plop the dough right into the oil and it still works just fine. But now I kind of like to organize and shape the dough just a little bit. I put it in the oiled pan, and then I'm going to oil my hands and I'm going to oil the top of the bread, and we're going to let this sit for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. This can really depend on how cold or warm your house is, how long this is going to take. I'm going to do nothing but cover it with some oil, cover the top with the lid, and let it sit, and you will see what it looks like when we're ready to finally shape and bake this focaccia. The focaccia is almost ready for the next step. You can see how beautiful and jiggly it is. So I'm going to go ahead and get this oven preheated to 400 degrees. So that's looking beautiful. My oven just preheated, and I am going to wet my hands, and I'm going to make a few dimples. Now I'm going to take my really high quality olive oil and put this on the top. Now it's time to top this with a really yummy flaky sea salt. And you can get really creative at this point. You can put fresh herbs on this. You can put fresh tomatoes. onions, any type of olive you like, but we're gonna keep it simple with just the beautiful olive oil and salt. Time to take the temperature of the focaccia. There we go, perfect. Look at that, wow. Yum. This is Focaccia. Makes some of the best sandwiches, especially if you have it nice and thick like that. Cut that, fill it with all sorts of goodness, and your family will not be disappointed. I do like to take the focaccia out of the baking dish relatively quickly and let it cool on a cooling rack so it doesn't get condensation and get soft on the bottom. We are going to cut into this at the end and do a taste test with Josh so you can see the beautiful bubbles and how incredibly delicious it is. But you saw just how easy it was to make that focaccia, and it is incredible. So again, if you've never made bread before and this feels intimidating to you, it is so easy. You can do it and you and your family will love it. Learning to take bread's temperature and knowing it's done when you get that proper reading is one of the biggest game changers when it comes to me feeling confident that the bread I'm baking is done, because then you know it's done. And it's just so nice to know that this bread is fully cooked. Now we do need to let this completely cool before we can cut into it. That's the second thing. Never cut your bread when it's super hot unless you're gonna eat all of it, because the steaming portion after taking bread out of the oven is actually finishing the cooking process. As good as homemade hot bread out of the oven is, if you don't eat it all right then, the rest of it's gonna be gummy because all the steam's gonna evaporate and it's not actually gonna finish that cooking process. So we're gonna let this cool here before we cut into it and do the taste test. The next recipe is gonna be a no-knead bread recipe, and it is even easier than the last recipe we just made. It has almost all the exact same ingredients. We're just gonna tweak the ratios a little bit and manipulate the dough just a little differently. So here I have 1.5 cups of water, and this calls for 3 cups of all-purpose flour. This is bread flour. You could use bread flour in this if you want. I generally make this with all-purpose flour, but if you have more bread flour on hand, you could certainly do that. I'm gonna add my flour right to my water. And this recipe does call for active yeast, but because this dough is going to sit for so long, it's okay if you don't pre-proof the yeast, along with 2 teaspoons of salt. This is a 1/2 teaspoon, that's why I'm doing 4 of those. And that is all the ingredients for this recipe. I'm gonna mix this together. This is also gonna be a sticky, shaggy dough. I just wet my hand just a little bit so that I can get in here and mix this dough up without it sticking to my hands. You don't have to knead this at all. I just want to make sure that the flour and water are incorporated well. And that's what it needs to look like. It doesn't have to look smooth or perfect or anything like that. What we're gonna do is we're gonna allow time to knead this dough for us. So I'm gonna spray it with a little bit of avocado spray just so that the top doesn't dry out. And now I'm gonna cover this. And I'm gonna set this on my counter over here, and I'm gonna let this sit until tomorrow, 12 to 18 hours. We will shape this and bake it. It is now the next day, and remember, all that we have in here is flour, water, yeast, and salt. And time is what got us to this point. So really, really easy. And now we're going to actually shape it. I'm going to put the silicone mat down just because I like to work with dough with a silicone mat down on my counter, but you don't need this. And I'm going to get some parchment paper out and flour it because it's going to be easier to manage this dough if I have a piece of parchment paper. So I'm going to well flour this because this is a very hydrated dough. Basically just means there's a lot of water to flour ratio, and so it's pretty sticky. And to shape it, all I'm going to do is do basically stretch and folds. I'm going to turn the dough onto itself, and what I'm trying to do is organize those gluten structures and create tension in the dough so that we have a nice smooth ball. And I'm just turning the dough onto itself until we have a beautiful smooth dough ball.
I don't do any fancy shaping. I just keep turning it onto itself, basically like it's one big roll. This is kind of how I shape rolls, and try to pinch the bottom together so that all of those seams are pinched. You can see now we have some good tension on the top. I'm going to put this on this well-floured surface, and then I'm going to put a little bit more flour on the top, and we're going to put this into our bowl. This is a bread that I usually serve as a side dish with dinner, but my sister uses this as a sandwich bread. She makes this recipe all the time, the one that lives in Oklahoma, and she will slice this up and make avocado toast. She will make sandwiches out of it. I never thought to do that till I went to Oklahoma to visit her, and I thought that was brilliant. It just depends on how thick you slice it, what you can do with it. So we're going to let this rise for a bit, and we're going to preheat the oven to 450 degrees. I'm also going to put a Dutch oven in the oven to preheat because we're going to bake this loaf in the Dutch oven. If you don't have an enamel Dutch oven, but you have a stainless steel one, you can use that as long as the lid is oven safe, and you can use that. And if you don't have either of those, I have baked this bread just straight in the oven and it works well. So with the oven's preheated, I'm going to score this loaf.
It's time to bake our no-knead bread. So I have my Dutch oven preheated in here. I've got a couple ice cubes in this bowl because we're going to use those ice cubes to help steam the crust so that the dough has time to rise and there's moisture in the pot before the crust sets. That's what the water is supposed to do, or the ice. And the ice just makes it so it doesn't evaporate quite as quickly. So what I do is I put my dough ball in there, I throw my ice cubes underneath the parchment paper. Be careful, this is extremely, extremely hot. I always keep my pot holder on top of my lid so that I don't on accident grab it. We're gonna close this, we're gonna cook this covered for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take the lid off and you'll see what that looks like when the lid comes off to finish the bake. The timer just went off to take the lid off of this Dutch oven here. So you wanna be very careful not to touch the top of your oven, and that's looking beautiful. It's already got some nice color to it, but we're gonna take the lid off and we are going to let this rise. We're gonna let this cook for another about 10 minutes. The best way to know if bread is done or not is to actually take its temperature. We want it about 200 degrees. I took that on the wrong side. And that is done. Perfect. I could have scored it a little bit more to get that knife cut a little bit more prominent, but it's gonna taste just as good. Perfect. So I'm gonna let this cool and we'll cut into it when we have all the rest of our bread done.
And here is what it looks like sitting next to basically the same thing, but the other loaf that is sitting next to it is one that you can mix up the day of and bake. The no-knead overnight bread is delicious, but you have to remember to make it up the night before. So I'm going to share with you in a bit how you can get the same loaf, but in one day.
Ciabatta is up next. This recipe, when I made this for the first time, it was in 2020 when none of us had anything better to do than bake. I remember making this and being blown away that something this delicious and crusty could be made at home with just a few simple ingredients. The only thing though with ciabatta is it does benefit from what's called making a sponge. And we just need to make this up the day before, and tomorrow we will make the dough. A sponge is just a fancy word for mixing together a little bit, I had too much there, of water together, flour, this is all-purpose flour, and some instant yeast. This sponge is going to increase the depth of flavor in the final ciabatta because this is going to ferment overnight and create lovely, delicious flavor notes that we wouldn't get if we didn't mix this together the day before. I'm going to go wet my hands again, and I'm going to mix this flour, water, yeast mixture together with my dampened hands. This is going to sit at room temperature overnight until tomorrow, and we will add this to our ciabatta dough that we make tomorrow.
It is the next day, and this is what our sponge looks like after sitting overnight. It is now time to actually make the ciabatta dough. So we're going to add basically the same ingredients, but we're going to add a little bit of milk. So we have water, milk, yeast, flour, and salt. We're going to mix that together with the sponge, and I pulled out the KitchenAid mixer this time because this needs to knead for quite some time, and I figured mixing it in a KitchenAid would just save my arms a little bit of effort. But again, if you don't have any mixer or any Dutch oven or anything like that, you can still make delicious bread at home by just using your arms to knead the bread. It's just going to take a lot longer. So here I'm going to mix these ingredients together until I get what is called a window pane test, which just means that I can pull the dough and it's not going to break. Do you see how I pulled the dough there and it was all ripping? That dough was not ready to have its final rise. It kneaded for about 10 minutes in the mixer, and now when I pull it off, you're going to see me stretch the dough, and that means the gluten has formed enough to where we have a really strong structure, and I can pull the dough, it's not tearing, and I'm actually going to be able to see through it, and that is called the window pane test. So I'm going to cover this and let it rest.
The ciabatta dough needs to have 2 sets of stretch and folds, which is just like what we've been doing with the other recipes when it comes to stretch and folds.
Just like before, working with wet hands, we're going to go up underneath the dough, stretch it gently, and fold it over until the dough doesn't want to do it anymore. And one thing you're going to notice throughout all this bread baking is that I'm fighting what used to be the urge to add more flour when dough was sticky. Working with wet hands is going to prevent the dough from sticking to your hands, and it's also going to give you a softer, moister bread. I used to have dry bread all the time, and it was because I was always adding more flour to prevent the stickiness and how hard it is to work with sticky dough. And really that does end up with a dry, dense loaf of bread. And so if you work with wet hands, you can prevent the stickiness, and you can also have a nice soft loaf of bread.
It's time to do our final stretch and fold for the ciabatta. It's starting to rise really nicely. Okay, let this rest again. For the ciabatta recipe, we need to create a steamy environment in the oven. So I have the oven preheated to 450 degrees. I'm also gonna put this pan of water in here to start steaming and make this a more steamed environment. I'm also going to take my griddle pan and put this in here. And I'm gonna bake these ciabatta buns on this griddle pan. If you have a pizza stone or a large cast iron, you can use that. But this is what I think is gonna be the easiest. So I'm gonna get that in there and let this oven start to get nice and steamy and my pan to get preheated. It's time to shape the ciabatta. I'm gonna well flour this surface, and I'm gonna grab a bench scraper because this dough is pretty sticky, and so it's nice to use a bench scraper, and I'm gonna go ahead and put my bench scraper in my flour. I'm trying to be gentle with this dough and not just deflate it completely, but we do need to shape this dough.
Now, I was just saying I'm not wanting to add flour into my dough. I'm using this flour to prevent the dough from sticking to the counter. I'm not actually going to knead this flour into the dough. So you will see that I'm not incorporating a ton of flour into the dough, even though I am using flour to prevent it from sticking to the counter. Now, you can also, at this point, shape this however you want. Use the same concept. If you want like dinner rolls, shape them into smaller pieces. I'm going to shape them into more like a whole loaf. So you'll see how I'm going to shape them into a whole loaf, but you could make smaller dinner rolls if you wanted to at this point.
So you can see there's still lots of air bubbles in here. I'm just gently stretching to get to a rectangle shape.
After stretching out the dough to a pretty good size rectangle, I'm going to fold it onto itself just like I would a letter, 1/3 up, 1/3 down, pinch the ends, and then I'm going to stretch the loaves just a little bit more, and we basically have shaped our loaves, and we're going to let this do a second proof after it is shaped, but I am going to put it on some parchment paper just so it's going to be easier to transfer into the oven. One little mistake I made here is I did not flour the parchment paper. So note to self, make sure you flour the parchment paper before you transfer your dough onto the parchment paper.
Okay, I'm gonna let this rest for about 30 minutes. Our ciabattas have been resting now. We need to kind of spread them out a little bit now that they've had time to rest. The gluten has relaxed a little bit after the shaping. I'm trying to be very gentle and not deflate the air bubbles, but it's not wanting to spring right back like it was earlier. I didn't quite flour this one enough. This one we might just have to keep the size it is because I did not flour the bottom of this one quite enough. But I can go ahead and transfer these into the oven. I'm gonna have to do this one at a time. And the recipe says to spray the tops of them. I don't have a spray bottle that just can be for water. That's why I'm doing the technique where I have the boiling water in the bottom here to create steam. And then also to create a little bit of steam instead of spraying them, because I don't have a spray bottle that I can do that. I just put a couple ice cubes around there. I'm gonna let the water go ahead and evaporate. I'll do that one more time, and then I will take out the steamer basket that I have in there. Let me turn the light off, and I will let those just finish baking. I can see that my ciabatta has that beautiful oven spring already that I want, and now I want it to brown nicely. So I'm gonna very, very carefully take this water out of the oven so that we can get that beautiful brown color that we want on it, and the crust doesn't steam on us. The steam originally is to make sure that crust doesn't harden too quick so you can get that beautiful oven spring. We already have it, so now we can remove the steam. Our ciabatta has that really nice color now, so I have a cooling rack here, and I am going to use the parchment paper to pull out this ciabatta bread. There's one of them.
At this point, we are now going to make a quick crusty loaf. I say quick, it still takes about 4 to 5 hours, but you don't have to have it sit overnight, which is nice. So if you forget to make your dough the night before, you can still have a crusty loaf on your family's dinner table the day you want to make bread. So we're going to start with water, a little bit of honey, yeast, and flour. So we're doing a couple things different than the no-knead dough to make this happen a little bit quicker for us. With the no-knead dough recipe, we let time work to our advantage. But at this point, if we want to have a loaf of bread on our table and we forgot to start the bread the night before, we don't have the luxury of time. So what we're going to do is add a little bit more yeast. We're going to add a little honey to help activate that yeast. And we are going to do a couple stretch and folds. So this is still a no-knead bread recipe, but we are going to stretch and fold and kind of coax those gluten structures to form a little bit quicker than just letting the dough sit for an extended period of time. I was just showing you my salt. I use an unrefined salt. And so if you ever see like little specks in my dough, it's because those are the minerals that are in the salt that are not removed when the salt is being processed, because it's not really processed. They just dig it out of the ground and grind it to whatever size, put it in a jar, and send it to your home. I actually had the opportunity a couple of years ago to go to the salt mine, which was pretty cool. But here we've got our dough. Again, very simple ingredients: salt, water, a little bit of honey, yeast, and flour. Now I'm going to wet my hand. I've got it mixed up with the spoon, and I'm just going to wet my hand and do a couple stretch and folds to get this dough into a nice-ish ball. It still looks really, really shaggy. I'm going to cover this and I'm going to let it sit, and we're going to do 2 rounds of stretch and folds about every 30-ish minutes or so. I may have done 3. It doesn't have to be exact, but you kind of just want to gently coax that dough into a nice ball. So we're not kneading this dough. We are just doing some gentle stretch and folds to help strengthen the dough and get a nice dough ball to form. So once we do our stretch and folds with our wet hand, I'll cover it, let it sit. We'll do some stretch and folds, cover it, let it sit, and then we will bake it. So very, very simple. It's time to shape our quick crusty loaf. So while this is being shaped and going to go through its final rise, I'm going to get this Dutch oven in the oven to preheat. To my well-floured surface, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my dough. This dough is absolutely beautiful. And I'm going to shape this a little bit different than I shaped the No Knead Crusty Loaf. The Crusty Loaf, I just turn it onto itself and keep turning it onto itself. This one, I'm going to kind of flatten it out just a tad, fold it onto itself like I would a letter. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And then I'm going to go from the short end, roll it up. And then I'm going to bring all the ends together just like I did with the No Knead loaf and try to create some good tension on the top of the loaf. More kind of like if you were to do a sourdough shape. I have done it this way. I've also done it the exact same way I do my crusty loaf, and they both turn out just fine. But this one I kind of wanted to show you a little bit different way to shape the loaf. Couple big air bubbles I'm going to pop real quick on the top. I'm going to cover this, and we're going to let this do its second rise while the Dutch oven preheats. I think my knife needs to be replaced, my blade. Going into the oven. Again, I'm going to keep my pot holder on my lid so I don't touch that. I'm going to put my bread in here, and I'm going to grab a couple ice cubes, throw that in the corner there, put the lid back on, close it up, cook it for 30 minutes, and then uncover it. At this point, it's been 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and uncover the pot, and then we'll let it finish cooking until it's really golden brown and the internal temperature has reached anywhere from about 205 degrees Fahrenheit to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. So it looks like we reached that temperature, which is perfect. So I'm going to pull this out and let it cool on a cooling rack completely before we cut into it. And here you can see just how beautiful and easy this quick-ish crusty loaf was to make. This next recipe is a very quick to come together recipe and quick from start to finish. We are going to make 1-hour dinner rolls. The one caveat is the temperature of your house can affect how quickly this rises, so it may take a little bit longer than an hour if your house tends to be a little bit cold. But the beauty of this recipe is it has quite a bit of yeast in it, so it does rise relatively quickly. You can also make this recipe by hand if you want, or you can use a stand mixer. I'm gonna go ahead and use my mixer today just to make it go a little bit quicker. And we're gonna start with water and milk and active dry yeast. And because it has a whole tablespoon of yeast, that's what makes this come together pretty quick.
The more yeast a recipe has, generally the quicker it's gonna rise and the quicker you're gonna be able to have your bread from start to finish. We're gonna let that sit together for just a minute or two until the yeast starts to get activated. 1, 2. Next, I'm gonna add our all-purpose flour. And I'm gonna start with 3½ cups, and I might need to add another ½ cup. We'll just see what the dough looks like. I like to put my flour and then my butter. I don't like to put my oils or anything like that on top of my yeast. So we're gonna get our butter in there. And our last ingredient is our salt. Now we're gonna turn this on. It's looking pretty good. I'm gonna let this knead for a few minutes, see if it starts to come together and if I need to add any more flour. This has been kneading for a few minutes, and I think that looks pretty good when it comes to how much flour. It's still a little sticky, but it hasn't kneaded the whole amount of time. So I'm just gonna let this go, and we're not gonna add any more flour at this point. One of the things that took me a long time to learn when it comes to making bread products is you want to use as little flour as necessary, because if you continue to add more and more flour, that's when your bread tends to come out dry and dense. And so that's why I really try to add a little less than, or like if a recipe has a range, or if it doesn't have a range, I'll start with a little bit less or on the lower end of the range and then work my way up and let it knead for a little bit, let it rest, and see if we need to add more flour at that point. And that little trick alone has really helped me have yummier, less dense bread. So this is looking really nice. We've got a nice smooth ball of dough here. I'm gonna take this ball and transfer it into this bowl. I'm gonna spray this with a little bit of oil just so it doesn't dry out. Now, I'm making another batch of bread in this mixer. If I wasn't, I would just let it rise in the mixer, but I'm gonna let it rise in here. I'm gonna go ahead and cover it, and we're gonna let this rest until it doubles in size. Our rolls have doubled in size, so we can get these shaped into our baking dish. This roll recipe makes 12 rolls that are pretty decent size. You could make them twice as small and get 24 rolls if you want, if you kind of wanted like mini rolls. This dough is so nice. And then I like to roll it into a log just because then I think I can get more even cuts on it. I'm gonna cut it in half, and half, and half, and then in thirds. This recipe also makes a really good bun recipe, like hamburger bun recipe. And all I do to shape these is I turn in the roll onto itself. I don't like to have too much flour at this point because I like the dough to stick to itself. And then I pinch it at the end, the seam side in. Make sure I have a nice tensioned dough ball. And we need to prepare our baking dish. Turning in the dough onto itself to create a nice smooth surface or tension on top of the roll. And then I'm going to use the side of my pinky and my palm and the side of my thumb to push the dough and rotate it onto itself, creating a smooth ball where I can then pinch the ends together. So again, folding the dough onto itself. To create a smooth ball. And now we're going to pinch the ends together perfect roll. Now we're gonna let these double in size.
At this point, our dough balls have risen really nicely. I'm going to crack an egg, mix it up, and I'm going to put an egg wash on my rolls. You can skip this step if you want to. I like the golden color it gives. You could also top these rolls with some sesame seeds or poppy seeds or everything but the bagel if you wanted, and that would be delicious as well, but I'm going to keep them plain. I use this exact same recipe and I turn them into hamburger buns. What I do instead of putting them into these dough balls when they bake is I actually take the dough and I roll it into a ball and then I flatten it out pretty flat. And instead of baking it in a dish like this, I bake it on a cookie sheet and I have hamburger buns as opposed to these absolutely beautiful and delicious dinner rolls.
This next recipe is a classic white sandwich bread recipe, and it is absolutely delicious, and it comes together really quickly as well. I have 2 cups of water here, and I'm gonna add some sugar as the sweetener in this. I make this with honey, with sugar. The recipe, it's written with sugar, but you can absolutely use honey if you prefer using that. Just know that you might need to use a little bit more flour or the higher amount of flour, because honey is stickier than white sugar. Now we're gonna add 1.5 tablespoons of active dry yeast. Do a quick mix on that and let that sit. While that's sitting, I'm gonna go ahead and measure out our oil. I am using avocado oil here. You can use olive oil or whatever kind of oil you like to use. And this recipe does make 2 loaves of bread. And so what I usually do, because my family can't go through 2 loaves of sandwich bread, usually in the time it takes you need to eat it before it goes bad, is I will slice the second one once it's cooled, wrap it up and freeze it sliced in the freezer. That way I can just pull out 1 or 2 pieces and toast them up, and we have homemade bread that's easy to toast. It's very hard to cut bread when it's frozen in a solid loaf. So I just found that trick. If you slice it first, then you can just pull 1 or 2 pieces out. And this yeast is already starting to get bubbly because the sugar in here is activating it relatively quickly. This yeast is going crazy, so I think it's ready for us to add the rest of the ingredients. And for this recipe, I do usually use bread flour. I'm gonna start with 5 cups, and I'll add the last half a cup if it needs it. I'm fluffing my flour before I start measuring it out because I don't want to use too much. I'll start with that. I'm going to add my oil and my salt. I'm going to add just a little bit more flour to this. And that's all the flour I'm going to add. So I definitely was on the little bit lighter side of flour today for this bread.
Humidity can really affect how much flour you need to add. That's why I always start with a little less and add more if it needs a little bit more.
This dough is looking nice. So what I'm going to do is actually let this dough just rise in the mixer. I'm going to stretch it out just a little bit so that it fits a little bit and it's not going to rise out of the bowl. Still a little sticky, but that's okay because we don't want a dry bread. I'm going to put the lid on and we're going to let this double in size. Our sandwich loaf dough has doubled in size, so we can get this shaped up. I'm going to have a very, very lightly floured surface here. This dough is absolutely beautiful. And I'm just going to make this into a little bit of a ball so that I can evenly divide it. You could absolutely weigh it to make sure you have 2 even loaves exactly, but I'm not going to do that. Well, let's just weigh this for fun and see how even I got it. Since I do have a scale right here, let's do it in grams because it will be a lot easier to see if they're even. 629. Okay, this one is a bit bigger. I'll take a little bit off. 660, 650. Okay, that's probably close enough. Now I do want to shape this as well. Kind of shape this into a rectangle. I don't want to add too much flour. That's why I kind of push most of my flour off to the side. And I want a smooth top on my loaf of bread. So I'm going to roll it up and then tuck the ends in. There's one loaf. Two loaf pans. I'm going to cover these and let these rise until they come above the loaf pan just a bit.
I'm going to cover these and let them rise until they fill the bread pan completely and actually proof above the bread pan by about 1/2 inch to 1 inch. And that's when you know they're ready, when you push on the dough and it doesn't spring back automatically. It just leaves a nice little indent. Your dough is ready to go and you can put it in the oven and go ahead and bake it. And you're going to see how beautiful this turns out.
Every time I make sandwich bread, I'm always worried that it's not going to rise and fill the bread pan. But it always does if you give it enough time. So we're gonna take its temperature. I did cover it because it was getting a little darker than I wanted. It was close last time. All right, perfect. So I can go ahead and take this out. Again, if you've never taken bread's temperature before to know if it's done, there's something so empowering knowing that your bread is completely cooked. So this is already out of the pan. I love these new pans. I've been slowly replacing all of my cookware to this USA pan. I got some as a gift and I've just fallen in love with it. So I'm gonna let this cool outside the pan. There we go. Oh my goodness, my house smells incredible. Sandwich bread is always the bread that I'm the most tempted to cut into while it's still hot. Yet I am gonna let it cool completely before we cut into it. We get to go ahead and finally cut into these loaves. So I wanna cut into the 2 rustic style loaves first because I've made both of these many times, but I've never made them at the same time and done a taste test and looked on the inside of them side by side. They feel incredible. So this is our 4-hour crusty loaf. This is our overnight crusty loaf. And the way I like to cut these loaves is usually in half first. So there is our overnight loaf. And here is our 4-hour loaf. And then what I like to do is top them up on their side and cut them down this way. You can see how beautiful and soft this is. Just perfection. Are you ready to do some taste tests?
Yeah, these look great.
We have 2 of the kind of artisan style loaves, but this is an overnight loaf, and this is one that I made and baked today. So I want to do a taste test side by side because I have never tasted them side by side before and see if we can tell if there's a more in-depth flavor with one of them because they are fermented for a different amount of time. So let's start with the overnight one.
They both have great feel to them.
Texture?
Good
yeah.
Texture. Which one was that? Overnight is this one,
Overnight
right?
is this one.
This was same day?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want crust?
Trust?
Crust?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. It's a great chew. The crust is perfect because it's not like sticking your gums.
Yeah, not too hard, it's soft still.
I'm gonna try just the
Crumb.
meat.
Yeah.
That's great.
Awesome. So let's taste the one that I made the dough and baked it today.
That's pretty good.
I almost think I like it better.
It's like softer.
It has honey in it. Only a tablespoon.
I wouldn't say it's sweet.
No, it's not sweet, but honestly, I think I like this one better.
I think so too. They're very, very close though.
If
Very, very
if
close.
you weren't tasting them side by side, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
It does look like the crust is a little bit thicker on the same day one, which is surprising.
I baked them the same temperature, same time. They basically have all the same ingredients except for the same day one has a little more yeast because it needs to rise faster, and it has a little bit of honey, but only a tablespoon.
They're great. They're both
Very
really
good. All right, so let's cut into the focaccia and the ciabatta. I'm gonna make a sandwich with this in just a minute with you all. So I'm gonna cut this in half and just show you what it looks like.
Oh, nice.
Yum. I think I'm just gonna cut a piece out of the middle so we can just take a taste test right out of the middle. Oh yeah, you can see, yummy. And then let's cut into the ciabatta while I'm right here. So typically how I like to cut ciabatta is actually open it up like this. So let me cut a piece in half. So that's what the side looks like, and that is beautiful. Look at those big bubbles in there. And I like to make sandwiches out of ciabatta. So normally I would cut it like this, and I just want to show you what it looks like that. Look at that. That would make a good sandwich too, but I was gonna make our sandwich for today out of the focaccia. Cheers.
Cheers. Great texture. A lot different taste.
This has the olive oil that I got from the local olive oil maker.
Interesting. Yeah, it's, I guess, a little saltier. You got the salt on top. Great
It's so
texture, though.
good.
Very, very chewy. Takes less effort to chew.
Bread is one of these funny things that it's really just a matter of manipulating the same ingredients, just different ways, different ratios of ingredients to get really different results. So this is ciabatta.
It's great. A little sweeter. This would be great on a sandwich.
Well, do you want me to make a sandwich out of that today?
Maybe I do.
Okay.
I mean, nothing's going to penetrate through that crust. It's a perfect.
Okay, we'll do it.
That's great.
I'm gonna show you what this bread looks like on the inside. Oh, I can already tell it's really soft.
It looks perfect.
We know what this tastes like. This is just really good classic white sandwich bread. And I just realized with my new pan, there's little marks, so you could actually cut it along those marks. Oh yeah, that's so soft. Look at that.
Nice and sweet.
There's a lot of sugar in this.
That's great. Does it have some of that olive oil in it as well?
Butter.
Butter?
No, avocado oil.
Okay. I can taste a little bit of that.
This is
That's great.
dangerous.
This is really good. Yeah, this with some jam on it.
Forget about it.
It's like more of a dessert than anything, I guess.
Well, Josh, thanks for being my taste tester.
Anytime.
I'm gonna make us up a sandwich, and I'll call you down when it's ready.
Sweet.
So here's just our roll. I'm just gonna show you what this looks like on the inside. Just a perfect, delicious dinner roll. We know what this tastes like. This is incredible. These actually make really, really good sliders. If you have some shredded beef or pork, delicious. Josh couldn't decide if he wanted his sandwich on focaccia or ciabatta, so I'm gonna show you how to make a sandwich out of both.
Perfect.
Oh my gosh, look at how beautiful that texture is. If you've never made focaccia, I think it's probably one of the easiest ones to make. Josh picked up these beautiful heirloom tomatoes at the store today. So we're going to make our sandwich with these. See if I can get 4 good slices out of it. And I do want to season up these tomatoes. I'm gonna start with a little bit of salt, pepper, and on our bread, I'm gonna put some of this fig vinegar that I got, the same place I bought that local olive oil. This olive oil, and I'm gonna put some of this olive oil on here. I'm gonna add some mayo. Have some provolone cheese here. I know most people think of baking as something they like to do more in the winter than the summer. I actually like to bake more in the summer than in the winter because when my tomatoes are coming in from my garden and my greens are, this is my favorite thing to have. And so I actually do a lot more bread baking come summertime than in the winter. Got some pepper turkey. I'm gonna layer this on really, really well. What I was wanting to make when I sent Josh to the store was a burrata tomato sandwich, but my store did not have burrata today. That's also something that I kind of think of as more of a summer thing, not January, but that's okay. This is gonna be good with provolone cheese. And then Josh had this deli turkey sliced super, super thin, which is how we like it. I kind of like to kind of stack it on itself. These are gonna be very incredible sandwiches. We don't have sandwiches very often, but they are probably one of my favorite things. You know what I think I'm gonna do? I'm gonna add some bacon. I like to keep pre-cooked bacon in my freezer. I just need to pop this in the microwave for about 30 to 45 seconds, and we're gonna have some beautiful crispy bacon. When I'm out at a restaurant, I never order anything on a ciabatta bun because usually they're so hard and chewy, but a homemade ciabatta bun, not even comparable. I have to say, even though it's January, Josh bought an heirloom tomato and you usually think those aren't gonna have any flavor. This one has pretty good flavor. Now I wanna try the focaccia one because I want to compare the two and see which sandwich I like better. I just asked Josh for his review on both sandwiches. He said, flavor-wise, focaccia wins down, hands down. The saltiness, the softness, just it wins. But he likes the eatability of the ciabatta sandwich better because it's not oily and or salty on the top. It's just a cleaner experience. And so that is his review. I make focaccia more than I make ciabatta just because the focaccia is so easy, but all these recipes are really, really easy. So if you wanna make some homemade bread, the recipes will be linked down below. If you've never done it, you can do it, super easy. And once you start making your own bread and you're realizing, oh, well, my dogs just tried to, or they did get one of the loaves of bread off of the counter. But what I was saying is once you start making your own homemade bread, you are gonna have a hard time wanting to buy bread because it just tastes so good. And you're gonna get used to that taste and you're gonna want that taste. So be careful if you start making your own bread because then you're gonna wanna keep making your own bread. So thank you, friends, so much though for taking time out of your day to spend time with me as we played around in the kitchen and got a lot of bread baking done. I have a lot of bread that I'm gonna go gift to my family and loved ones because we can't go through this much bread. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being you. If you wanna watch some more videos, I'll pop some videos here. You can go enjoy between now and my next upload. I hope you're having a fantastic day and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye, friend.